The 80s and 90s were filled to the brim with new IPs making their mark on the gaming industry. We had titles like the original Super Mario Bros. In 1985, Castlevania in 1986 alongside Metroid, and Mega Man in 1987. Regardless of what people may think of them today, these games brought with them many elements that would be reused and refined to build upon the side-scroller genre. The typical platformer aspect more so fell on Mario and Mega Man though, as Metroid and Castlevania are not exactly what I'd call traditional in that regard. But if you look closely, there's something all of these games have in common, and no, it's not the notorious ball-busting difficulty, although I'd probably only argue that Mega Man and Castlevania really fit that description. No, all of these games were staples of the Nintendo Entertainment System. This meant that Sega, at the time, was being practically shut out in terms of standout titles. The Sega Master System was released in Japan in 1985, the same year that Super Mario Bros. Came out for the NES. This unfortunate timing put them behind their competition, but rather than immediately jumping on a game that could compete with Mario, they waited until the release of their 16-bit console just a few years later, the SEGA Genesis, or the Mega Drive if you live outside of North America. A couple of years later, in 1990, Sega began working on a game that would star a newly created mascot for the company. After a year of character design and game development, Sonic the Hedgehog was released for the Genesis. When it first came out, a game like this was a big deal. It did away with the slower, more methodical type of platforming that games of the time were focused on, and instead delivered an exhilarating sense of speed and excitement. Or at least that's what Sega claimed it did. Of course, we all know Sonic became a huge gaming icon after his debut. He's the classic character used to rival the platforming giant himself. And while his name nowadays might be met with polarizing opinions, it doesn't change the fact that he had a definable hot streak back in the 90s. But was the game that started it all really as good as it's often regarded to be? Now, I don't want to bore y'all with my overly long personal history with this blue rat, so I'll keep this short. As a kid in the early 2000s, my original exposure to Sonic was thanks to my cousin who, at the time, owned a SEGA Genesis that I didn't have. I don't really recall exactly when I got my first chance to play the classics, or even which one I started with, but I remember eventually getting a Sega Dreamcast and a demo disc that had a Sonic Adventure trial on it. I played that demo constantly, completely content to repeat the only stage that was available on it to no end. And I guess at some point or other my parents got really sick of hearing the exact same shit over and over, because eventually they bought me the full game, and that solidified my love for the franchise. From then on, I made it my goal to play every Sonic game I could get my hands on, even the ones that were, like these. I guess I should be thankful that I didn't have a huge variety of consoles growing up. That kinda helped me avoid some of the more unholy entries of the series. Anyway, my personal history aside, what exactly are we getting into with Sonic 1? I mean, okay, do I really need to go that much further into it? I already kind of talked about his conception and the whole premise behind him being made, but there's not a whole lot more to it. He's Sonic, he was made to be cooler than Mario and to go fast. There you go, that's Sonic 1. There is of course more to say about this dynamic between Mario and Sonic, but I'll save that for a little later in the video. Okay, fine, I guess if I have to, I can give a short story synopsis. Dr. Eggman Dr. Robotnik is stealing animals from the tropical paradise known as South Island and using them to create robots. These robots, known canonically as Badniks, were created to help him achieve the goal of collecting all six Chaos Emeralds in an attempt to take over the world. This story is about as simple as you can get, so I'm not even going to waste any more time on it. It's your classic hero versus villain scenario, and that's perfectly fine for 1991 and an introductory game for the franchise. Before I really get into the gameplay, I just want to bring up an issue I ran into when recording footage for this video. I initially played the game via the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Classics collection on Steam. I had figured that this would be the easiest way to play all the classic games together and would likely cause the least issues since it's an official release. Unfortunately, I encountered frame rate issues in almost all of the games I played. On top of that, there was some odd amount of input lag that I felt on my controller. Originally, I thought this was because I was recording while playing, but my computer is more than capable of handling recording a Sega Genesis game. I realized that when I switched over to an emulator though, these problems were almost completely resolved. With that said, most of the footage you'll be seeing is from the emulated version of the game, although I do own legitimate copies of all of them. I also won't hold any of those issues that I experienced against the game as I discuss it. So, when discussing a game like this, I feel like it's important to consider a lot of different factors that might explain why something does or doesn't work. To more effectively explain my points across this video, I'm going to give a quick rundown of what I think is important to highlight here. First, a big part of what gives games their identity is the creative intent behind them. In the case of Sonic the Hedgehog, his identity is that he's the cooler, faster, and overall more out there Mario. His marketing was essentially that the character mocks the slower paced style of platforming that's characteristic of Mario. So right off the bat, the game has created two sets of expectations for me. I'm going to go fast, and it's going to be really cool. Second, there's the mechanics of the game. Essentially what I'm asking here is, do the abilities of the character work well in the context of the game and what it's meant to be? So again, for Sonic, I expect him to be fairly capable of picking up and maintaining speed. And he is, given the proper level design or circumstances. Mechanics like being able to roll into a ball on a slope and getting insane speed work really well and are exactly the type of thing that I would want here. But like I said, a lot of that is dependent on my next factor, the level design. Do the levels in this game complement both the creative intent and the mechanics to make the game the devs envisioned? Now, I don't want to jump the gun here because I obviously want you to watch the rest of the video, but a big issue I have with Sonic 1 is the level design. It's all over the place in terms of how it wants you to progress and play the game, and that's not always a bad thing to be clear, but problems come up when you sell me a game with a certain setup and immediately fail to deliver what was promised. I'll go into more detail about this when I touch on each zone though, so I won't overload you with it here. So here they are, the 3 things that I'll be considering as I dive into each zone of this game. It's fortunate that this game isn't very long, or we might be here for a while. So with that out of the way, let's get into our first stage, Green Hill Zone. This is undoubtedly one of the most, if not the most, iconic Sonic stages. That is not an excuse though, SEGA, to reuse this zone in every single new game you release. The zone gives you a good variety of structures to run, roll, and jump through to get a feel for how Sonic controls and what he's capable of. Speaking of which, his introductory title is surprisingly bare bones in terms of mechanics. You can jump like in any other platformer, although Sonic curls into a ball when you do, allowing you to safely hit enemies from above, on their side, or even below them. He can also curl into a ball on the ground when pressing down with any sort of speed. Using this ability on slopes nets you ridiculous amounts of speed, and it's pretty satisfying to do, honestly, although there are times when you want to be a little more reserved with it. And really, that's all there is to him. He's a remarkably simple character without an overwhelming amount of abilities to work with. The game just expects you to use those few mechanics to the best of your ability. These abilities, for the most part, are more than enough to get you through the 3 acts and corresponding boss fight of each zone. Aside from that, there are rings to collect to save yourself from death, collect 100 and you'll get an extra life, although that rarely happens in this game, power-ups like the shield and invincibility box, and plenty of springs to help you gain speed or reach higher ground. You can also sometimes perform a move known as the Badnik bounce on enemies or item monitors. Basically, if you fall from a great enough height onto one of these objects, you'll bounce much higher than you typically would from a standing jump. It can even be chained together to achieve some pretty fun combos. I didn't really pull it off very often in my 3 playthroughs I did for this video, and I can't tell if that's because I'm rusty on the best locations to achieve it, or if Sonic 1 just doesn't lend itself to it happening often. It's also a little oddly named since you can perform this maneuver on more than just Badniks, but I digress. Getting back into the stage itself, I think Green Hill sets up the identity it truly wants for Sonic the Hedgehog. The zone is fun and fast paced, but also has its fair share of platforming challenges and avoiding obstacles. It's a really nice introduction to this style of gameplay. So then, what did they do for the next zone? Completely change the formula. Yeah, you can still do everything you could do in Green Hill, but Marble Zone decides to clamp a ball and chain onto our poor blue boy's ankles. Speed is your enemy in this stage. While you definitely could just mash down that right button on the D-pad or analog stick and take hit upon hit upon hit, this zone really wants you to take it slow. And I guess a proper question to ask here is that really such a bad thing? Well, the answer is yes and no. I talked about Mario briefly earlier, so let's use him as a comparison. Look at how Super Mario Bros. Plays. The casual speed, the smaller sprite size, the more simplistic level design. Even at top speed, there's ample time to take in your surroundings and adjust your actions to face most oncoming challenges. Aside from all of that, Mario was built on a fundamentally different design philosophy than Sonic was. In most Mario games, you're able to take all challenges at pretty much any speed and achieve similar and satisfactory results. Playing the game more conservatively and carefully jumping through obstacles is still enjoyable. And on the other end of the spectrum, trying to speedrun levels is also really fun when you understand the timing and know what you're doing. The game doesn't really railroad you into one particular playstyle, except in the instances where there might be a lot of shit to avoid. Sonic, however, is built on the concept of pure, high-speed platforming. There's a similar amount of room to see what's ahead of you, but when you factor in the larger sprite size and quicker pace, it becomes an entirely different beast. So now, throwing in level design that would normally work for a character like Mario does not work for a character who's fast like Sonic. And to this, you could definitely say, well, just play the game slower then. Who cares what its creative intent and all that other garbage is? And to that, I say, well, yeah, I guess you can, but you tell me, which looks more fun? This or this? This or this? This or oh my, dude, I made a joke about you already. Please just go away. I just think that Sonic Team did a huge disservice to the game by putting a pin in the ideas created in Green Hill when they should have built on them instead. Ultimately, this is just one man's opinion, so feel free to take it with as many grains of salt as you need. This zone is also the first instance of annoying enemy and hazard placement. I mean, look at this shit here. How was I supposed to know that a spiky chandelier would come crashing onto my head from off screen? It's definitely something that can be avoided if you take a look at the level design and maybe predict it, or if you have experience with these levels, but is that really good design for a Sonic game? If I wanted to go slow and glare at stage structure to determine where any potential threats might be lurking, a Sonic game is the last thing that I would be looking for. Fortunately, we can breathe a little easier with this next zone. If you want my opinion, Spring Yard Zone should have been the second stage of the game over Marble Zone. It does a much better job of taking the sense of speed and exhilaration from Green Hill and translating it to a more difficult setting. Is it perfect? No. It still has those few instances of being forced to slow down when you want to go fast, or else you risk running into an absolute shit ton of spikes. Overall though, a passable zone that really doesn't need too much time spent on it. I will say though that it has one of my favorite tracks in the game. So, y'all remember how I said Spring Yard felt like it was actually building upon what Green Hill laid out, right? Well, joke's on you, because Labyrinth Zone takes all of that fun, bottles it up all nice and tight, and drops the bottle in the center of a lake for you to go and fetch. Honestly, I don't think I've met a single person who likes this zone. I mean, sure, the music is catchy, and aesthetically it's not bad or anything, but holy shit, it's literally just Marble Zone underwater. Not to say that the structure is exactly the same or anything, but it's so slow, it's so tedious, and it's so boring. I mean, look at this shit. Does it look like I'm having fun? And no, don't tell me it's just because it's a water level and all water levels are trash. Hydrocity from Sonic 3 is a water level too, but that zone is amazing. At least there they have the decency to keep underwater segments more limited and give you alternate paths to avoid them. And yeah, Labyrinth Zone does have alternate paths sometimes, but they're still underwater! That's not even factoring in just how much worse the issue of getting completely blindsided gets in this zone. Look at that spike ball! How the hell am I supposed to know that was there? Other areas do a decent enough job of at least giving you some visual cue to avoid this shit, but can you really call something as small as this noticeable? Not to mention the fact that this zone is where the infamous Sonic drowning music makes its thoroughly unwanted debut. When you're underwater, you rightfully need air to breathe. You can get that by either resurfacing, provided there's a spot nearby to do that, or by waiting for these little ground bubble fuckers to spawn a big enough one for you to steal the air out of. The thing is, not only does this take the pace of the stage out back and kill it, it also feels completely luck-based when these fucking bubbles will appear. And so, you're left with a choice. You either play the game slowly and methodically, you know, how SEGA says you won't be playing their game, or you pray to some almighty being above that these bubbles appear when you need them to. Oh, and did I mention that this zone can get particularly disgusting with the fucking slowdown? Whatever, it's not even worth groaning about anymore, it's just not a good zone, let's move on. After the pain that was Labyrinth Zone, Starlight is an unexpectedly decent return to form. It, similarly to Spring Yard, plays like a harder Green Hill. There's a good amount of speed and enjoyable platforming here, and it's much lighter on the bullshit. I'm not really a fan of the bomb enemies that you encounter, mainly because you can't damage them and they like to shove them in tight-ass corridors like this, but it's overall an inoffensive zone. So much so that I barely have any notes about it. So here we are, the final zone of the game. Well, not like the final zone, but never mind, we'll get to that. Scrap Brain Zone is one that I feel is rather middling in terms of quality. Don't get me wrong, this zone is hard and can definitely be frustrating, but it's not quite the slog that Marble and Labyrinth Zone are. That said, I really dislike the design of some of these hazards. Things like the flamethrowers trick you into thinking they're just typical textures because they're drawn into the floors and ceilings. And even once you know what they look like and can keep an eye out for them, are they really obvious enough to justify being designed this way? Plus, sometimes they just make no sense. Look at this, why am I not able to duck under that? Sonic looks like he's perfectly snug and tight out of harm's way, but nope, that tiny little gap was just there to give me false hope. It's also here that the devs decided to go a little too hard with bottomless pits. They're not everywhere, but they seem to just show up at the drop of a hat, and before you know it, you're just... Once again, this zone slows down more than I feel it should, but I'm more willing to accept it as the last true zone of the game. I'm not, however, willing to accept the fact that they thought Act 3 should be even more Labyrinth Zone. Why would you... Why? Just... Now then, we've chased Robotnik through all of South Island, so now it's time to lay the final smackdown on the big man himself. The final zone, as it's called, is barely a zone at all. It's literally just this one hallway leading into the final boss room, and the boss itself is rather easy, if a little awkward. It just boils down to avoiding the balls of electricity, praying to God you don't get unluckily crushed, and jumping into them enough times. The fight's honestly more boring than it is difficult. I did admittedly die a few times on my first go at it, but that could have been due to the issues I was having with the Steam version, so I'm not particularly concerned about that. You also don't get any rings for this fight, but the only actual danger is getting crushed, so it really doesn't matter, does it? And once Dr. Robotnik is defeated, we're treated to a nice little ending medley accompanied by footage of the zones we just played and... Oh, right, the Chaos Emeralds. Well, they're not the most important thing here, so I'll just explain them really quickly. If you complete any stage with at least 50 rings, this giant ring will appear after the goalpost. Jumping into it will transport you to this game's special stages, a strange psychedelic maze where you have to attempt to roll to the Chaos Emerald and free it from its diamond prison without touching the goal circles. Who made these special stages? They're so weird. I honestly didn't even bother trying to get them all. There's no Supersonic in this game, so they just serve to show you an end screen that isn't this juggling jackass. Speaking of Robotnik, I also didn't even talk about any of the boss fights save for the final one. They're all pretty easy and unremarkable though, so it's not really worth going into great detail about. That said, I do really like the concept of the Starlight Zone encounter, but the Labyrinth Zone boss is barely a boss at all. It's just chasing Robotnik through this gauntlet of traps. Anyway, Sonic runs through Green Hill for the billionth time and the day is saved. Hoorah. So, I just threw a large amount of information at you, and all of this information was gathered with the goal of answering one question. Is Sonic 1 a good game? And in my honest opinion, Sonic 1 can be a fun time if you already have some experience with it. The first playthrough of this game can be like a roller coaster where the builder didn't know how tall he wanted each rise to be or how steep each drop should be. Its pacing, difficulty, and general fun factor can be all over the place. But what I noticed was that after completing my third playthrough for this video alone, I'd only died once or twice from stupid mistakes that were generally my fault. And on this third playthrough, even zones I'd been aggravated with before were much easier to get through. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not saying that levels like Marble Zone and Labyrinth Zone are good, but when you know the ins and outs, they're much less painful, you know? Like I said before, my biggest issue with this game is the level design. When the stages are built in a way that promotes high-speed platforming action, it can be pretty enjoyable. But too often I found myself bored as I stood on a block for decades or slowly jumped up a cliffside underwater. This isn't a terrible game, but it's much more difficult to go back to than the other Genesis titles, and maybe that isn't just because of the level design. The lack of a spin dash is also readily apparent if you've played any of the other games in the franchise, and I honestly feel like it would have made some of the levels a bit more fun. I think though, one of the biggest things that keeps me from playing this game more often is just how much worse the bad content feels compared to how fun the good content is. If you noticed throughout the video, I spent way more time talking about aspects of the game that annoyed me, and many of the better zones I basically glossed over. And that's not because they aren't fun, but it's just because they aren't impactful enough to make me want to go further in depth with them. Now, at the end of the day, would I recommend this game to someone trying to get into the classic Sonic series? Hell no. You start with Sonic 2 for that, but that's for another video. Sonic 1, as it is a game that's competent and somewhat fun at its best, but an annoying slog at its worst. And frankly, even as a Sonic fan, I don't mind putting this one on the shelf indefinitely. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this video. I know it was like 20 minutes of me just talking about a dumb game from 1991 that's completely irrelevant at this point, but maybe you enjoyed it and learned something you didn't know about Sonic 1. I do plan on doing more of these videos. I already have one for Sonic 2 that's in the works. Footage is recorded. I've started scripting it, so maybe look forward to that in the near future. And then beyond that, maybe some of the 3D titles. That would be kind of cool. And I also just want to make it completely clear, if you love this game, that's perfectly fine. Everything that I shared here was just my opinion on Sonic 1 and why I don't think it's a very strong game, but I still played it like 3 or 4 times for this dumbass video, and I still, to an extent, really enjoy it, so I was just trying to give it a more critical look instead of having my nostalgia goggles on. But if you love it, hey, that's all up to you. That you're completely allowed to do that. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you all in a future video. Take care, y'all.